All right, ladies and gentlemen, we're going to start Unit 6, which is called The Consequences of Industrialization Between 1750 and 1900. If you go to the AP College Board website for World History, you can look up the topics for this unit. So if this might help you for your note taking, I'll let you know what they are. 6.1 is the rationales for imperialism. 6.2 is state expansion. 6.3 is indigenous responses to state expansion. 6.4 is going to be global economic development. 6.5 will be economic imperialism. 6.6 will be the causes of migration in an interconnected world. And 6.7 will be the effects of migration. And as we know, 6.8 is kind of like this review of everything, and it's the causation in the imperial age. So, really, when we talk about consequences of industrialization, what we mean is we're talking about the effects of industrialization. We know that Unit 5 was revolutions, and we talked about the Industrial Revolution. So you need to know about all the effects of what happened during this industrialization. All right. So this is a cartoon. It's going to go into a little bit more in a later slide, but I kind of want to go into detail right now. We are going to hit political cartoons a lot this unit. So for right now, let's discuss this one. Here, this was done by a French artist. It depicts the German Chancellor Otto von Bismarck slicing up a cake labeled Africa at the Berlin Conference, which was held around December of 1884 to about February of 1885. So again, it's like this 3-month meeting. Representatives from 13 European states, the United States, and the Ottoman Empire meet to split up the African continent. Many European explorers had even yet to set foot on most of it. So there were huge swaths of land that they didn't even know what was there or who was there. With the exception of Ethiopia and Liberia, all the states that make up present day Africa were parceled out among the people in that room. There was no African representative in that room. Lines of longitude and latitude, rivers, and mountain ranges were used as borders, despite the existing territories that were already in place. As a result, we're going to have civil war amongst the tribes, and there's going to be a lot of poverty due to trade routes being cut off. And of course, we know that the effects are still ongoing today. So, why did we do this? What are the justifications? And that's the rationales. That's what we're going to talk about. Let's dive into it some. Time period is late 19th to the 20th century. The definition of imperialism is the domination of European powers. Later, of course, the United States and Japan are going to jump in over subject lands in the larger world. And this is not just going to happen in Africa either. As you can tell in this map, that's Latin America, where we're going to get to this a little bit later as to all the other parts of the world that we're taking over. So the reasons, of course, the first one's economic. We needed raw materials and the markets to sell these manufactured items to. Second one's political. Think of it like this. They're going to plant flags down because they want to say, this is mine. I'm going to take it. This is mine. And you really want to get a bigger nation back home. You want to become more powerful. And we're going to see this as the United States and Japan do become more powerful as they acquire more land. So the more land you have, the more powerful you are. And of course, there's social, because these people went on what are known as civilizing missions. They believed that everyone around the world, if they weren't like them, they were uncivilized. So it was everyone else's job to go out there and civilize these people. And then there is the religious reasons. We want to go and convert indigenous populations, typically to Christianity. It's going to be Catholicism or Christianity. It's not really going to be any other religions during this time. Those are the big, it's all about God and Jesus right now. Now, this is The White Man's Burden. It's a poem by Rudyard Kipling. We are going to go into this in class, whether you're in Miss Saunders' class or Miss Nesbitt's class. We're going to take a deep dive into this. You are more than welcome to pause this slide, go over this yourself, but we're going to go over it in class, so don't worry about it. I will say this, though. Let me go back. Is it satire? We don't know. And if you're not sure what the definition of satire is, we're going to go over that as well. But you get to explore that. So if you need to take a brief moment, go back to your notes, because by the time you're watching this, you've probably already gone over the satire. Maybe look over this. Try to figure out, is it satire? What kind of satire is it? Maybe it is, maybe it isn't. He never said it was satire. So it's kind of hard to decipher. Granted, we can't go back and ask him. All right, here's another reason. In the 1870s, we had this idea called social Darwinism. This is the racial and ethnic differences. They were a result of biology. That was the idea of social Darwinism. And they believed that white people were the most evolved. And of course, this was based on very, very faulty science. This is also going to be used in support of eugenics, racism, fascism, and later Nazism. It's an idea that is as ridiculous as phrenology. And if you want to look that up, it's Phrenology. Phrenology was the study that was like created in 1796 and used in great deal in 1810 to 1840. They would basically touch your head and feel for lumps and go, okay, well, this person's going to be a criminal. You could have been 6 years old, but they were touching your head going, this child will be a future criminal. We need to lock him up now. So, as ridiculous as that is, so is social Darwinism. You could always maybe compare those two if you want to look more into phrenology later on in life, but two very, very ridiculous ideas that had terrible consequences. Other rationales. Now, on the spice tea means technology, we have to hit technology. Let's talk a little bit about quinine. Quinine is an active ingredient in this plant called cinchona. It's found in Peru. Spanish colonizers learned of this plant and gave it its name. It's an effective treatment against malaria and the most important example of the role of colonialism in the global distribution of the drug. It was introduced in the 1500s, and then in the 1820s, these two French chemists isolated this active ingredient, quinine, which enabled the industrial production of the drug. Quinine really takes off during this time. You guys know about steamships and the Suez Canal. Suez Canal is really important. That's why there's a picture of Egypt here. This connected the Mediterranean Sea to the Red Sea. This is essentially making it easier for explorers or merchants, essentially, to go from the Atlantic Ocean to the Indian Ocean instead of going around Africa. So you try to visualize this or stop this and get a map if you need to. But you're in the Atlantic Ocean, you go through over to the Mediterranean, you go down the Suez, you go to the Red Sea, and the Red Sea will take you to the Indian Ocean. It's a much quicker route than going around the southern tip of Africa. The Panama Canal, yes, it happens in 1904, but this is going to connect the Atlantic Ocean, to the Pacific Ocean, and America kind of owned it. Eventually, they gave it back a long time later, but eventually they did. Then we've talked about railroads and we've talked about the telegraph, both very important pieces of technology, essentially, that were used during imperialism. So, other things we need to really talk about is all of these resources. So, cotton was something that we would export from Egypt. Why did we need it? Textiles, obviously. Rubber we get from Amazon and the Congo Basin. We need it for tires, for shoes, for hoses, and etc. Palm oil came from the sub-Saharan Africa, and we would use this to lubricate industrial machines because remember, we've got the Industrial Revolution. Now we need to lubricate all those parts so they don't clog up. And then guano, which if you've not heard of that before, it's poop from, I know it's from bats. It could be from some other type of animal, but it's poop, and it comes from Peru and Chile, and it was used as fertilizer. Then we have meat from Uruguay and Argentina. That's a food, obviously, and then diamonds from Africa for luxury purposes. So this is another reason we're doing imperialism, because we want to take these goods, use them, sell them back. Fantastic, at a higher markup. So I talked a little bit that we're going to go into 6.2, if you guys remember that. So this is state expansion. So let's talk about this some more. State power is going to go to a shift. Remember Portugal and Spain, they were really big. They're taking apart South America. They're going to start to lose power. Well, again, I've said this, this will be my third time. The United States and Japan will gain power. So the Mughal Empire, we know that it started around 1526. It's going to end officially around 1857, but it's going to start to weaken by 1700. Just like Ottoman's weakening, by many historians' viewpoints, was actually long before the empire's quote-unquote death. So just know that by 1700, Mughal power is actually starting to weaken. So we have the British East India Company is making huge profits from opium, cotton, tea, and coffee exports. And they have these Indian troops called sepoys, and they enforce the company rules. So these are Indian men working for the British East India Company. Oh, but guess what? We're going to have some problems. There were these cultural conflicts that is going to cause a friction between the sepoys and the British, which will end up in the Sepoy Rebellion of 1857. All right. The sepoy regiments received these new Enfield rifles. These new bullets would arrive in cartridges, and I'm going to show you a picture in just a second. They were protected from moisture in a paper covered in an animal fat wax. The Hindu and Muslim sepoys were instructed to use their teeth to tear off the wax paper and then load their guns. Simple enough. However, the Hindus feared that the animal fat may have come from a cow, so they refused the order. The Muslims refused to do it because they feared the fat came from a pig. Therefore, the British were not respecting the cultures of these two religious groups of people. The British did eventually end up changing the packaging, but it was too little, too late. They were disrespectful of the culture, which sparks a war for independence. There were other things that were making them mad, but this is that like one spark that lights it, that makes people go, you've got to be insane. Why are we letting the British be here? However, the British are going to win, unfortunately. And as a result, we will talk about it. State expansion is going to lead to mercantilism, but let's talk a little bit about this little gun here. It's a percussion lock rifle. And here's the idea. You've got this grease cartridge down here on the bottom left. It's got a paper case, it's got the powder and the bullet inside. So the soldier is going to tear open the end of the cartridge with his teeth. He pours the powder down the muzzle of the rifle, then he thrusts the bullet, still wrapped in the cartridge paper, which makes it a tight fit, into the muzzle. He takes the ramrod, which is on the top. You can see that little sticky thing from the slot beneath the rifle in the barrel, rams the paper bullet and powder into the bottom of the barrel. Simple, easy, except when you're covered in some type of animal fat and you're Hindu or Muslim, you don't know where it comes from, and the British aren't telling you, it becomes a problem. So state expansion, like I said, it's going to lead to the fact that England's taking over. They are going to take over all of India. And it's essentially mercantilism. So the economic theory, this is what mercantilism is, as a sort of reminder, it's the economic theory that trade generates wealth and is stimulated by the accumulation of profitable balances, which a government should encourage by means of protectionism. So India is producing all the raw materials and the food as an export economy, but India is then forced to purchase British finished goods. So their own textile industry was essentially destroyed. And here, of course, you have Queen Victoria on their money, Queen Victoria being the English queen. She was the longest reigning monarch until Queen Elizabeth II took over that title. You don't need to know that. That's just fun information. So what's the impact? What are the effects of all of these events? Well, the British emphasis on cash crop farming, sorry about that, cotton, they would force them to grow cotton, led to food shortages and famine. Also, you have the class system with the British at the top. And who's at the bottom? Not the British, but the Indians. The good thing is they have railroads and sewer systems are built. This will reduce the cholera deaths. However, then we have a rise of nationalism. So there's a man named Ram Mohan Roy. He gets the title of Raja by Akbar II. He wanted to abolish the practices of sati and child marriage. He saw that the British East India Company was draining money from India at a rate of 3 million pounds a year. So pounds, of course, is their currency. But let's think about this, 3 million pounds. And at this time, his time was about 1830. Today's money would be $344,922,230. That's today's money. Sorry, not dollars, pounds. That would be today's money. He wanted free trade for India. He wanted more money left for the people of India, which had a substantially larger population than where the money was going to. So it makes sense. Having been exposed to Western culture, because he originally actually worked for the British East India Company in the revenue department, he forms his ideology based on Western values while also fighting for a sense of nationalism. He's now known as the father of modern India. So nationalism wasn't necessarily bad under him. This idea of it, as we know, nationalism is going to get bad later on. It's a slippery slope. All right. Now we talked about opium. So we're leaving India. We're going to go to China. The opium was grown in India. It was being sold to China, of course, addicting millions of people. The British would sell the opium for silver, so in exchange for silver, which was then used to then give back to the Chinese and for tea. So it was this ongoing circle of, I will give you opium, you give me silver, I will give you silver, and I give me your tea. Because as we know, the British love tea. We talked about the Opium War about 2 weeks ago, right before the midterms. So the efforts to stop the trade are going to ignite the war. We had the Opium War. The Chinese lose because we know that the Qing later emperors were corrupt, didn't take time to really adapt new technologies. Therefore, the British technologies were far more advanced. So as a result of the Opium War, there were these unequal treaties. The Treaty of Nanjing, or known as Nanking, depends on where you look it up, which curtailed the Chinese sovereignty. Also, France, Germany, the US, and Japan also signed unequal treaties. And by 1900, 90 ports in the area were controlled by foreign powers. Because remember, prior, they only had the Canton system. That was one port. Now they had about 90. Now, we've also talked about the Taiping Rebellion. You should probably know about this one. This leads to 20 to 30 million deaths. Then we have the self-strengthening movement. That was a program of internal reform based on this idea of borrowing from the West, but not being the West. And then there was the Boxer Rebellion, which remember that Empress Dowager called people the foreign devils. So they killed a lot of Christians. And we know that this fails because the Americans and the British come in to kind of save the day, and it, of course, undermines the Qing legitimacy, and the Qing collapses in 1911. All right. Let's talk about this just for half a second. You really need to know about China and Japan and how they confront the West. China is going to remain committed to its traditional values. They're going to lose numerous territorial conflicts, even to Japan. They're going to grant other nation spheres of influence within China, and they will finally accept necessity for reform. Japan's going to consider modernization to be necessary to catch up. They're going to borrow and adapt Western ways. They're going to strengthen their own economic and military power, and they will become an empire builder. They both have well-established traditional values. They both, of course, initially resist change, and they both oppose Western imperialism. So they have things in common. All right, Singapore. The British arrive in Singapore in 1819. On the bottom, you can see where it is. They see it as the perfect port. It's right there in this beautiful part of the world, the South China Sea. It's great. They can stop there, they can fill up, go on their way, and keep trading. The Sultan at the time was very weak due to factions within his own country, which led to a treaty being signed. It became an official British possession in 1824, with another treaty being signed, only becoming truly independent in 1965. The British are also going to conquer Malaysia in the 1870s to 1880s because it's a great place to export rubber from, and the British are basically going to control the sea lanes from the South China Sea to the Indian Ocean. All right, the first permanent British settlers were convicts sent to exile over in the Australia-New Zealand area in 1788. There was a gold rush in 1851, which brings many free settlers. Yes, there was a gold rush over there, just like there was a gold rush in America. And of course, many Chinese are going to arrive as well. Now, I talked about the fact that we're going to go over some cartoons. The one on the right, I want to kind of touch on for half a second. This is a cartoon, and you guys know who Uncle Sam is. That's kind of like this embodiment of what America is. If you've never seen an Uncle Sam poster, I'd really like you to pause this and kind of go just Google it real quick. But on the right, England had its own version of Uncle Sam. We called him John Bull. He's an imaginary figure. He's not based on anyone real. But he is the personification for the United Kingdom, specifically, though, England. And as you can tell from this cartoon, he has a hand in every part of the world. Egypt, India, Canada, Jamaica, there's Gibraltar, Borsland, Australia, Malta. I know I can read Ireland there. A few other places, a little bit harder to read, but essentially he has his hand on everything. England has a control over everything. Here we go on the effects of British Australia. There were a group of people there called the Aborigines, just like America has like the Native Americans, erroneously called the Indians by Christopher Columbus. The Aborigines in Australia were there before the white people showed up, but they're going to suffer due to the introduction of diseases they had never encountered. And of course, others are going to be displaced because white people will take the land for hunting and herding. And then British New Zealand, their group of people are the Maori, and they're going to suffer again due to disease. There was obviously a voluntary migration of British. The British are going to come in. They want for whaling and timber, and the Maori are going to battle the British, but lose and are essentially displaced. If you've seen Thor Ragnarok, the director and the man who plays Korg is from New Zealand. All right, here we go. Imperialism, like I said earlier, not just in Asia. The British are going to construct a port of Buenos Aires and in Argentina. The industrial states had a distinct economic advantage, so they can go to these countries and take parts and say, okay, we're going to put a port here, we're going to put a port here. Our technologies are better than yours. Watch us take over and take you out. So keep that in mind. It wasn't just that they could just show up, they showed up with guns ablazing. The people that were there were not prepared for it. So like I said, we were going to hit Latin America. The British hit Latin America. So the saying goes, the sun never sets on the British Empire. Essentially, as you know, the earth spins and the sun kind of sets on different parts of the world. If you look at this and you're thinking that the sun's going from left to right or right to left, I'm not sure how space works. I'm not into that. But if you think about it, if you just have your finger on the right hand side of the screen and you slowly move it as though that's the sun, it will still never set on the British Empire. There will be a piece of red always showing, no matter what. Even if you get all the way to the end and you're thinking, "Ooh, Alaska isn't British," you're right. But by that stage, Australia is already lit up again if that was the sun. So think about that. British owned a piece everywhere. All right, the French are also going to get on it as well. They build what is known as Indochina. That's today's Vietnam, Cambodia, and Laos. They also take some territory in West Africa. Thailand, which was originally known as Siam, it remains independent as a buffer between the British and the French. This is going to be a big problem much later. As you know, Vietnam, the Vietnam War, we'll get to that around unit 7, 8. I think it might be 8 or 9. But we're going to get to the consequences of this state expansion at some point. State expansion for the Dutch. So you know how there's the British East India Company, there's also the Dutch East India Company. And in this whole area here, the Dutch East India Company owned it, but then they shift the power to the Dutch government. So they end up controlling all of this area down here. This is, of course, Southeast Asia. Please know the difference between Southeast Asia and South Asia before you get to that AP exam. Because if they ask you about an essay about Southeast Asia and you somehow bring up India, you'll get 0 points. All right, the United States is not immune to any of this. We have the Trail of Tears, which was the forced migration of Native Americans from their homeland in Georgia into Oklahoma under the presidency of Andrew Jackson. This was the idea of manifest destiny. I'm sure many of you are familiar with this term. It was this idea that God gave Americans all this land, it should be theirs. Of course, people already lived there, but we just kind of pushed them out of the way. So state expansion on Africa. Here it is, the map. You really kind of want to look at this. At some point, this may show up again. Just kind of going to give you a hint. But as you can tell, there were some small parts that were independent, but the green is French, the yellow is British. We had a little bit of Italian in here, German, Spanish, Portuguese, and of course the Belgian Congo. I apologize if you're colorblind. We'll help you somehow. All right. So the Berlin Conference already talked about it. This was this idea, we're going to split up all of Africa. No African leaders were invited. There was no regard for the language that was there, no regard for the religious or the tribal associations. Imagine you're living with your family and you guys are one of 50 members of your family and you've got this huge piece of land, but then all of a sudden the British people come in and they say, well, this is our country here. And the French go, well, this is our country too. We're going to split this line down the middle. All this land you and your family have ever owned is now split. Well, you guys are now split. So all this split in between, you got 25 people on one side, 25 people on the other, because you're all in one family, maybe you're all in a tribe. Well, now 25 of you have to deal with another tribe that you guys you peacefully coexist, but you don't want to hang out and become family. But the British say, well, nope, 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 you're in our country now. You guys have to be best friends. This is what's going to cause all these civil wars within these countries. Congo, it was a free state. It becomes the Belgian Congo. King Leopold II organizes it in 1878 as a private commercial company, just like the British East India Company was once, just like the Dutch East India Company. My point is, I'm making comparisons. So he sets up this private commercial company to exploit the rubber resources. Of course, the company was known for its terrible working conditions, and they forced the labor onto people. 4 to 8 million people die. Of course, that's such a huge number. Is it four? Is it eight? We don't know. Numbers were not kept as well as they probably should have been. So eventually, because this private commercial company did such a bad job, the Belgian government just takes over the entire area. Now, in South Africa, we have a group of people called the Boers. They're also known as the Afrikaners. They are a Southern African ethnic group descended from a predominantly group of like Dutch settlers that first arrived at the Cape of Good Hope in the 17th and 18th centuries. So the British seek to extend their control in this area, and conflict is going to arise as a result of this. So the Afrikaners undertake the great trek eastward to move away from that British rule. The Afrikaners overcome the local resistance. They actually set up their own areas, the Republic of Natal, the Orange Free State, and the Transvaal in the mid 1800s. The British discovered diamonds and gold in South Africa, so war is going to break out. There were concentration camps set up that were used to racially separate prisoners. And as a result of all of this, the Afrikaners lost by 1902, and the British are going to consolidate the Union of South Africa. White society is going to dominate Black Africans, which will result in a term that we will get to. It's called apartheid. It's kind of messy. If you happen to have ever seen this movie or maybe have Disney Plus, uh, Disney Channel movie you might want to just check out. It's one of my favorites. It's called The Color of Friendship. It is based on a true story. Kind of corny, yes, but the idea is still sound. That'll just tell you about apartheid. It's not going to tell you about the Boer Wars. All right, so the human toll of imperialism in this area. Here's a picture of a family's farm that was actually burned to the ground because the British Army and a lot of armies talk about this idea of scorched earth. If we can't have it, no one can have it. We're going to burn it all down. During the war, farms were destroyed, fields were salted, so you won't be able to farm on that land anymore, and wells are going to be poisoned to keep the Boers from feeding their fighting men. The families that lived inside would then be dragged off to a concentration camp where many would eventually die. This is a picture of a little girl named Lizzie Van Zyl. She was dying, unfortunately. She contracted typhoid fever in the camp and slowly withered away. She could not speak English. The nurses who tried to help her were told by the camp heads not to interfere with the child as she was a nuisance. The native South Africans are put to work building a railway line in this picture. The original caption of this photograph, which was meant to be propaganda to defend the use of concentration camps, proudly notes that the forced laborers were singing while they worked. So I really want to talk about this cartoon. Told you we'd be talking about them. This cartoon was drawn by the French in 1898. It's called China, the Cake of Kings and of Emperors. This Qing official is observing powerlessly as a pastry representing China is divided up by Queen Victoria of the United Kingdom, Kaiser Wilhelm II of Germany, Tsar Nicholas II of Russia, and a samurai of Japan. Marianne of France, she's on the top right. She was an ally of Russia. She just looks on. And these notes on the left will kind of help you out when it comes to themes for imperialism. Of course, take a moment to pause if you need to write that down. So, migration trends. This gets a little bit later when we talk about the causes and effects of migration. Population is going to increase globally because we've got all this new food. We talked about medicine being invented post-industrial revolution. We've got new modes of transportation. Migrants are going to relocate to cities because of urbanization, and that's where the jobs are. The United States is going to receive the majority of migrants. It's this new promised land. There's all these new states that are popping up. Some are freely located, and of course, we have indentured servitude and convict labor, which is still continuing. And we know that slavery is still a deal in the Americas. While they were not transporting slaves rather, there were terrible things still occurring. And officially, slave ships were not sailing. That doesn't mean much for the unofficial pirates that were bringing men and sometimes women over. So a lot of Irish, of course, were coming over to the United States. The reason, if I'm going to say, okay, what's the cause? The potato famine from 1845 to 1850. Please look this up if you're not familiar with it. Although from reading some of your writings, your SAQs over the midterm, I know that some of you in Miss Saunders' class are very well aware of the potato famine. The pull, what was the reason? What made them go to America? Well, there was also economic opportunity. Oh, what are they going to encounter when they get there? Anti-Catholic prejudice because people didn't like the Catholics. It was big in New York City and in Chicago and San Francisco. But of course, these Irish men are going to take low wage jobs, some women too, such as laying rail lines because they need the money. And that was in the East, they're going to take those jobs. But they did sometimes catch these, you'd see these help wanted signs, and they would say, no Irish need apply. Now the Chinese, they're gonna, if they can get jobs, they're gonna lay the railway lines in the West. So what's their push? You've got economic chaos in China. What pulls into America? Again, economic opportunity and the California gold rush. And a lot of them were manual laborers. They were dealing in agricultural, and of course they work on the Transcontinental Railroad on the west coast of America. And you have Irish people on the east coast of America. But anti-Chinese sentiment was strong. They're the only group ever to be excluded fully. Of course, now we know with the Muslims, they are also being excluded to an extent, although the Supreme Court keeps knocking it down. So there's the Chinese Exclusion Act. This goes into a little bit more in China, slide 38. This was passed in 1882. It prevented Chinese laborers from immigrating to the United States. It prevented those that were living here already from gaining citizenship. There were some exceptions. Teachers, officials, and some merchants were allowed to come here, but in 1924, all Chinese were excluded, and citizens from other Asian countries were also excluded from coming here. And this remained in effect until 1943. So the effects of migration. We had the creation of urban ethnic enclaves. When you hear about towns called, or cities rather, Chinatown, that's an urban ethnic enclave. That's where they feel safest. They're going to stay with people that live like them, who are culturally alike. Why, if you come to a new country and you don't know the language, you can at least be around people who speak your language. And then women are going to take on new roles. The women that are left behind in the old countries, they're going to take on the new roles in their home, in their society, because the migrants that come to, like America, for example, are mostly men. So the women are left behind. This is going to change societies in other countries. I already talked about the Chinese Exclusion Act. I want to also touch on the White Australian policy. This is actually a set of policies that started in 1901. They do start to get dismantled by the government between 1949 and 1973. The cause of the White Australian policies was a competition in gold fields between the British that were living there and the Chinese miners that were immigrating there. Also, labor unions there opposed the importation of Pacific Islanders into sugar plantations because their point was, why are you bringing those people here? They're going to work for lower wages. It goes back to that old argument, they're stealing our jobs. So all of these little exclusion acts tend to come from a base of, well, racism. Okay. I mean, look at the ad on the top right, keep Australia white. It's racism. A lot of our countries today still deal with these issues. I wouldn't say maybe they were effects, long-standing effects. I'd say that some of these things just don't go away overnight. All right, societies at a crossroads. Let's talk about this briefly. The Ottoman Empire, we know in 1672, look how much land it has, and by 1882, it is starting to shrink. We know that it's going to go down by 1920s. All right, there's a slow decline since the 17th century. We've talked about this. We talked about the Tanzimat reforms. This is in your notes for Unit 5 because we went a little bit ahead, just because it all kind of molds together. We know that they had secular schooling. They were taking European schooling ideas and their reforms, and they did change their law code to get rid of the Sharia law and institute French legal code, except in, I believe it was divorce and marriage. Then you have the young educated citizens and religious conservatives. They hate the reforms because it undermines their religious foundations. And then you have Abdul Hamid's despotic rule. It generates those liberal opposition groups. And the young Turks are going to seize power in the 1908 coup. They want universal suffrage. They want religious freedom. They want emancipation for women during their rule sultan's reign, but they do not rule. And the empire survives because European diplomats couldn't agree on how to get rid of the empire without upsetting the balance of power. So, if you want to know about this, it'll pop up in your reading. Probably already has popped up a little bit because I know I had you guys read a little bit ahead in my class, and I know the AMSCO class and Miss Nisbet's class and the kids in my class who are reading that, you guys are going to touch on that as well. Russia, let's touch on this because next unit, it's not going to go well. It's not going to be a happy ending. And I know that Miss Nesbitt's class talked about Anastasia, and I hope my kids have seen it too. So Alexander II is going to abolish serfdom because we know he wants to encourage industrialization. They build that Trans-Siberian Railroad. We got that steel, that coal, the petroleum. It's going to attract the Europeans over to Russia. Nicholas II is going to take power in 1894. There was Bloody Sunday, which was protesters in 1905. They stormed St. Petersburg. They demand that representative government. So he establishes his version of a parliament called the Duma. But we already know it was too little too late because the Romanov dynasty is going to be in trouble. And the Bolshevik Revolution's just around the corner. So I hope that you guys took some notes. This was a pretty short PowerPoint. This is only a few days in this unit. We're going to hit it hard and fast. I hope you enjoyed. I hope you took notes. All right. If you have any questions, you can ask Miss Nesbitt or myself. Have a wonderful day. Goodbye.